a question, I think, in the chat room. I saw it popping up about paraphernalia and toddy drinking, I think. Yep. So if I may, I'm going to read you something from Charles Dickens.
Yeah, please do, yeah.
Sorry, there's a screen. Whiskey in Scotland is a national institution. The implements for making toddy are household gods, which descend as heirlooms from one generation to another. These implements consist of a brass or silver toddy kettle, Exhibit A, toddy kettle, a quaint black whiskey bottle of the Dutch character, a certain number of stout tumblers with feet on them, little square or oblong doilies, sacred to toddy, and a dozen or two of silver toddy ladles. No householder considers himself completely set up in life unless he possesses the proper implements for making and drinking toddy. And the consumption of this national compound is a grand ceremonial, a solemn sacrifice to Bacchus, conducted with great state and circumstance. That's toddy drinking summed up for you by Charles Dickens. Toddy kettle, toddy bowl here. I think it's just some bloody old Glaswegian fruit bowl, but someone sold it to me for 400 quid, I think. It's sort of me coming down the road on that one.
Actually, Nick, I've got a matching one to that if you want another one. If that's the money you're paying.
one's enough, and then spoons and ladles. So all that stuff, toddy drinking, it's great. Should be revived.
Yeah,
so I did have a question. Sorry.
Go on, you're all right, Michael.
For Nick. So it's weird reading about toddies, and you've got the kind of British and Irish history of it, and then the Indian history of it. Do you think that it's a question of it originated in one place and then was moved to the other, or is it kind of a convergent evolution in drinks where both places have recognized this is all good for a cold, we'll have it all together?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine in Ireland and Scotland it's sort of convergent, but I would also think that in India, toddy drinking was taken out there by the various engines of colonial growth, you know, whether it's civil servants or armed forces, traders, one sort of another. And of course, in Africa, toddy is totally different because it's made with arak and palm wine. So that's a totally different beast. And it's not drunk as a hot beverage, I don't think, either. So it's a little bit of both, I think, to be honest.
Yeah, I think so, because essentially, I mean, the toddies are a single serve punch. And if you look at whiskey punch, you know, during the great era of punch drinking from the kind of mid 18th century onwards, whiskey punch was always served hot, screeching hot, in the words of James Hogg. And so toddy's becoming quite a natural progression and evolution of the whiskey punch, which was, you know, dished out in large bowls, similar to the one that Nick's just been ripped off for, to these kind of single serves. So I think it's an evolution of the whiskey punch, basically.
I was going to say earlier, Dave, you know which side, and you all know which side I fall on. Obviously, mix it and drink it how you like it, blah blah blah. But just for the sake of argument, if toddy is the persistent form of enjoying whiskey, you don't need 110 different distilleries making 110 different things. It's sort of a blessing that we have these Glencairn glasses and this proclivity of people sticking their noses in glasses and writing tweets and blogs, isn't it? Because then we sort of force the need for all these different colors in the palate. Otherwise, we just have a rich one, a smoky one, and a sweet one, don't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is part of whiskey's evolution. You know, I think, you know, when you get that fundamental shift taking place, driven by the blenders that Nick was talking about, then you get greater complexity, because then the public begin to want greater complexity, and you see this multiplicity of different styles beginning to emerge. We do forget, you know, that there were plenty of single malts available in the 19th century as well. But you know, that big shift that took place, driven by blenders, that is the evolution of the Scotch whisky industry. You know, that is complexity really beginning to emerge, and also because, you know, distillers It'd be a bit pointless for Mr. Grant, you know, to make exactly the same whiskey as Mr. Cowie down the road. You know,
But here's
it was beholden on distillers as well to begin to differentiate themselves in a shifting commercial environment as well. So,
here's the other thing, which you know, no one ever wants to talk about effluent, do they?
I knew you were going to get onto that, Nick. Yeah.
No one ever wants to talk about the sordid issue of effluent. The reason you ended up with so many distilleries was that there were natural limits on the size that a distillery could be. And that natural limit on the size of distilleries was well outpaced by demand, which was one of the reasons why grain whiskey started being used, apart from the fact that it had an ameliorative effect on the single malts it was being mixed and blended with. And the biggest break for most people on the size of your distillery was how you disposed of your effluent and where you could put it. Why are there so many individual distilleries on Speyside? Because the distiller only had so much ground, he could only have so many settling tanks. The various riparian, so that's the fishing right owners on the Spey, were on their backs all the time from the 1860s and certainly in the 1880s when all the distilleries started to be new distilleries set up and distilleries expanded. So this idea that, you know, why have we got all these different whiskies and lots of stuff? It's because you had to supply the overall demand. The size of the operating unit was limited, and it was principally limited, as I said, by effluent.
I mean, yeah, I mean that's the interesting thing, that we've come all this way and we're back to talking shit. It's almost like we're talking to our again. But you know, that's the interesting thing, that it doesn't matter whether you know, when we talk about whiskey, it doesn't matter what your opinions are. It all comes straight back to talking about people and how people are drinking it, how people are enjoying it. And it emphasizes the fact that whiskey is a social drink.
Yeah,
and, you know,
I absolutely. You know, I think this, you know, the idea of the kind of solitary whiskey drinker, you know, if it fills him with dread, you know, it's a convivial spirit. It's there to be enjoyed in a responsible fashion, but, you know, it's there to be enjoyed with friends, you know, whether that's, you know, ideally face to face, but, you know, even in an environment like this, you know, yeah, I absolutely. And I think it's an aspect of whiskey that I think was beginning to be forgotten, certainly in the UK. But, you know, Sam, Nick and I, you know, we're in the ridiculously privileged position of having traveled around the world. And you look at the way in which whiskey is consumed in Taiwan, for example, or Latin America, you know, where there is the bottle on the table and there's a bucket of ice and there's mixers and whatever, and everybody's enjoying it, you know, and that is the way. That's the inspiring thing about whiskey for me, you know, to see it being consumed in that particular way. Then you come back to Scotland and it's kind of, oh no, it's my dram and I'm having it on, you know, it's just kind of listen up, guys, you know, it's you know, I've said for many years, you know, it's an amazing drink. It's a complex drink. It's a hugely versatile drink. It's endlessly fascinating, but it's just a drink. You know?
Yeah, and I mean the interesting thing with that is, you know, like Nick was just saying, that the distilleries are obviously then built on size and how you can get rid of your effluent or shit, whatever we want to call it, your waste products. And when you look around Scotland, if we're going to talk about Scotch and Scotland, it does make sense that, you know, you've got these areas where there are plenty of distilleries. You look at the Highlands where there's not as many. There's obviously not the need for the waste products as well.
Yeah, because to some extent the waste. I mean, obviously the draff and stuff was used directly, you know, in the olden days as a cattle feed, unprocessed in any way, and to an extent some of the pot ale could be used as a fertilizer, but you still just had so much stuff that you had to get rid of. I think the more interesting thing is to think about in terms of that sort of, well, all of these distilleries and where are they and why are they, is why is there a distillery on Skye, for God's sake? Whoever thought that was a decent place to make whiskey, you know, to get barley out to get casks out to get coal to, and then to get it all back into Glasgow or wherever it has to go on a boat or something. I mean, it's nuts. It's nuts, really. And that I think is a rather more fascinating sort of conundrum, you know, to deal with.
Well, I think the fascinating thing about a distillery in Skye as well, Nick, is the fact that it survived for that length of time as well, you know, which came down to quality.
Mm.
You know, it's always, I was doing a thing with on Tam na Bhfuiln the other night. I mean, it's really fascinating to think back, realize that, you know, Tam na Bhfuiln was the second distillery to be built in Glenlivet, and it was built in the 1960s. And there was not another distillery in Glenlivet, which had been the nexus point of whiskey distillation in that part of Scotland because of transport.
Yeah.
You know, it was bloody hard for, you know, George Smith to get his spirit all the way down, you know, down to market.
Yeah, and I mean,
that's another area, you know. And why did the Glenlivet survive? Because it was highly regarded in terms of the quality of its spirit. Why did Talisker survive? Because it was highly regarded by the quality of its spirit. You know, so there's another kind of layer that begins to get built in. You know?
Same with places like Clynelish as well, which is an equally bonkers place to make whiskey, you know.
Yeah. Or Pulteney. I mean, who would even want to go to Wick, to be honest?
And it's seen as we've mentioned Clynelish, obviously there's that little distillery just opposite there that hopefully coming back online, Brora. Can you tell us much about that at the moment, Nick? Or
Well, we were talking earlier about how passionate people are about making whiskey, right? And that no one has a monopoly on passion. You know, I mean, it's just out there in the world of whiskey. And I was sent a photograph. It's the most wonderful photograph. Sorry, it's not on this computer. It's on a different one. The week before last, of three men who spent the past almost 2 years doing the rebuild at Brora, leading the rebuild project. And they were standing up at the worm tub, the wash still worm tub, with steam coming off the worm tub, and they were running running water through the stills, you know, check the pipe work, all that sort of stuff. So the position of Brora is very, very close to commissioning to making whiskey, you know, which is really a astonishing thing. I never thought it would happen, you know. So quite how we got that one signed off, I've got no idea, but it's going to be great. And of course, then Port Ellen will come along, I think probably now towards the end of next year. But
I mean, that is the interesting thing, that, you know, all of a sudden we see kind of an upsurge in whiskey being produced and all these new distilleries coming online. And then we have these kind of three important distilleries, Port Ellen, Brora, and obviously Rosebank coming back online as well. You know, it's a very exciting time for whiskey. I
think so. It's you know, if anyone had told me those, I mean, I was there when Rosebank closed, and that was really sort of depressing moment, because I had to go in and make films and stuff, sort of the last production, and you felt like you were picking over a corpse. It was a really uncomfortable sort of feeling. And if people don't know, one of the reasons it was closed was just because of all the access problems to the site, with the size of vehicles that people use and all of that sort of stuff. So it just became very difficult to continue to operate there, which was, it was the same at Glenurry actually as well, at Stonehaven. It was more of an access issue. And if anyone had told me that Rosebank and Port Ellen and Brora would come back, I would never believe them. So I think it's in this respect, at least, hats off to all those crazy malt people who who are putting money into the category and making it possible to do that.
I mean, I remember sitting down on a table after a whiskey festival about 5 years ago, with people like Colin Dunn and that, and talking about the rumours of Port Ellen and Brora coming back online, and the looks that I was getting, is like, you're mad, it's never going to happen. And then 4 years down the line, 5 years down the line, it's like, yeah, they're about to come back online.
Yeah. I'll tell you one thing. I was involved in the group that sort of put the proposals together to get signed off in Diageo, and it was either or, right? It was going to be either Port Ellen or Brora, and there was a very small group of people, top secret and all the rest of it, and we just sat around and we just said, you know what? Let's do both of them. And it was like a light bulb going off. We went, yeah, let's do both of them. And it got signed off. I mean, it was...
and just in time for your retirement, all those bottles under your desk must be worth a fortune.
Yeah. In my dreams. I
mean, how do you feel about these distilleries coming back online, Dave? Does it excite you to the fact of all distilleries coming back? Or are you more excited with new distilleries coming online? Or do you see the old ones as new distilleries?
I see the old ones as new distilleries, to be honest. I see it as part of the reset of Scotch whisky. Coming back to a point that Nick was making earlier, styles were crafted by blenders. Absolutely true. But I think when you're dealing with new distilleries now, who aren't set up to sell fillings to blenders, they're set up to be single malt brands. That then changes the mindset of the distiller, and the distiller then looks at different ways in which to make whiskey, rather than simply being, beholden to what the blender wants. And again, it's not this binary thing. It's not right or wrong. It's just the world has changed. The single malt is a category. It is a new category. 1990s, really. So I'm really excited as to what happens with, Brora 2.0 and Port Ellen 2.0. What style of Port Ellen is going to be made? What style of Brora is going to be made?
I mean, that's the interesting question as to, we kind of know that Brora is probably going to be easier to make like it used to be. Are we expecting Port Ellen to taste like it used to?
Well, I hope.
Well, yes,
to
exactly.
be perfectly honest.
No,
I hope
you see, that leads me on to another question, depending on your answers. See.
So again, I saw a question coming up about stills. So the stills at Brora are the old stills, which went down to Abercrombie's and were reconditioned and have gone back. The stills at Port Ellen will be newly fabricated along the lines of the stills that went in there in the 60s when it was reopened.
Okay, so they are made exactly like the old ones?
My understanding is that they are as close as they can be to the style of stills that were put in the 60s at Port Ellen, 1960s, not 1860s.
Also, where'd you go with Port Ellen? Because Port Ellen opened, then it closed for a very long time, then it reopened.
Yeah.
So where do you go? You can't go back.
And
the world has moved on.
The interesting thing is, well, what did it taste like? I mean, Port Ellen did not have a great reputation as a whiskey, which is why people weren't that sad to see it go when it closed. And it's quite interesting because obviously you can go out and buy bottles at auction and stuff like that, or get samples from some of these older bottles to get an idea of what the whiskey tasted like. But actually, in terms of the Brora project and Port Ellen, but not to such an extent, we had such good records about Brora, including very, very detailed technical drawings, very, very detailed technical drawings from the 19th century. So our engineers actually took these, as it were, took these technical drawings apart, and they were able to construct the size of the vessels. And from the basis of the size of the vessels, that meant they could figure out how much barley was going in for each make. And, so we actually sort of on paper reconstructed the whiskey making process at Brora. And then we've got some very sharp people who are in our office at Elgin, and they said, well, if that's how they were doing it, broadly speaking, this is what it would have tasted like. This is what it would have tasted like. And that's the magic of science. And I was astonished, and Dave will know some of the people who are involved in this conversation. They're not silly or stupid, they know what they're talking about. It was Donna, Dave, actually, and it was really? And she said, yeah. She said, I can tell you within that much of a parameter about what style of whiskey would have been produced with that plant.
Always believe Donna.
Yeah, yeah.
Extraordinary.
I mean,
Yeah.
the interesting thing there, though, is that if we're going to bring Port Ellen back online, if we're going to bring Brora back and Rosebank to some extent, and we're going to emulate what the whiskey tasted like, doesn't that debunk the theory of terroir and the barley making the taste of the whiskey? Because if we can make the whiskey taste like it used to with a new distillery, then it's not about that. It's about the process and the people making it.
Yeah, but there is something weird about it. There's this interesting thing called lactobacillus, and here's kind of theory. It's not quite been borne out yet, but there have been lactobacillus exists within every distillery, and especially the long fermentations. Lactobacillus kicks in, and it helps to acidify the wash. It creates flavor, in other words. And there has been some research done into lactobacillus at various distilleries. And it would appear that every distillery has its own particular colony and specific to that particular plant. So whether, and this is the thing that hasn't been proved, whether the influence of that individual colony within that distillery has a direct effect on flavor, that's yet to be ascertained. But that could be one element with that kind of weird thing about distillery character, you're rebuilding Lefroy within Lagavulin and only ever being able to make malt mill rather than Lefroy. Perhaps that is part of this kind of weird mysterious terroir thing that's going on. That Port Ellen will make what Port Ellen wants to make. Will it be the same as it was? No.
Yeah. So I'll read you a little quote from something written by a man called Stuart Hasty. Stuart Hasty is truly one of the unsung greats of the whiskey industry. He ran the Hazelburn lab for Whitehorse Distillers, which was set up after the First World War, then went on to work within the DCL and ended up running Scottish Malt Distillers, which was all of DCL's distilleries, up until his retirement in the 50s. So he was a scientist. He was an interventionist. In fact, he created the sort of interventionist philosophy that not just Diageo, but most large distillers now have in terms of the way they run their distilling regimes. So this is what he wrote. We still await experiments which will prove exactly why the whiskey from any one distillery in Scotland is peculiar to that distillery and cannot be duplicated anywhere else. I have been told by certain distillers that the character and flavour peculiar to individual distilleries, turn over the page, peculiar to individual distilleries is determined by what they are pleased to call local ferments. Local ferments. What these are, I do not know. I have known of well-known distillers refusing to have their fermenting rooms cleaned, leaving the roof with all its natural cobwebs, etc., in the belief that certain yeasts lived there and these would drop down into the fermentation vessels and influence the fermentation. Exclamation mark, as if to say, are they fucking nuts? Well, of course, they're not nuts. And that's exactly what Dave's talking about. That's exactly what Dave's talking about. And that is that point of terroir, which is, you could move Lagavulin 500 yards up the road and it would make a different whiskey. Make a different whiskey, And Peter Mackie with Malt Mill, he tried to turn Hazelburn into a Speyside style distillery and tried to do this, tried to do that. Science will take you so far. Science will take you so far. And then there's this unknown element, the local ferments, which Hasty hated the idea of it. What are they talking about? And then that's I think that's for me, that's the more interesting part of this discussion about not terroir, but about place, as Dave rightly calls it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting, like we say, that we bring it back to place and we bring it again back to people. And as much as we want to argue whether it's right or wrong, it keeps coming back to the same arguments, that it's place and people.
Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with that. No, I wouldn't even say there's an argument of right or wrong. I mean, it's that's the way it is, and that's the way it always has been.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
and then that's the joy of whiskey. You know, that's why I think we're in the golden age of whiskey. You know, because it isn't just Scotland anymore. You know,
No.
you've got an entire reset that's taking place in Ireland. You've got 35 plus distilleries in England, 1,000 distilleries in France making whiskey at the moment. You know, extraordinary things that are happening in whiskey. This is a very, very exciting time that we're living in. It's probably too much getting made, but that's probably a different discussion.
It's
a
was
really
actually.
exciting time.
Yeah. I was about to sort of say that. Do we think that there is too much being made now? Do we think it's going to be detrimental to the industry?
I think. I mean, if you look at the hard stats, there's more whiskey. You know, the amount of whiskey being consumed isn't keeping pace with the number of whiskey distilleries being established. You know, the overall consumption is rising, but rising slowly, and the volume of whiskey getting produced around the world is rising rapidly. So yeah, we are paddling in a whiskey loch, global whiskey loch, I would say. So yeah, some rebalancing is going to have to take place.
I mean, that's the interesting thing, that, you know, we look at Brora coming back online, we look at Port Ellen. Is that going to be detrimental for other distilleries within the Diageo thing, that they may end up closing in a couple of years' time once they come back online?
Well, the size of Brora and Port Ellen is tiny. I mean, they're going to be as small as our smallest distilleries like Lochnagar. So the impact that they will have on any other sort of production scale will be non-existent. You know, if decisions are taken about production, it won't be because of Port Ellen and Brora. It'll be about other issues.
I mean, one sort of question I did want to bring up while we've got people that really know what they're talking about as well is, one thing that's starting to come around at the moment is the discussion about regions and Speyside, lowlands, highlands. Do we think the regions are important anymore? Do they have a place in whiskey anymore?
Yeah, I think they do, but I think the regional talk is kind of part two. I think the important thing is we're talking single malt here. The important thing is the distillery. You know, and I think the closer you look at the regional argument, you know, that Speyside is this one thing, and you know, Highlands, which stretches from the outskirts of Glasgow to Wick, and indeed all the islands. You know, I don't think it stands up to any intellectual scrutiny, to be perfectly honest. You know, you wouldn't even be able to say all the distilleries in Dufton make the same style. You know, so yeah, I think there will be an increasing focus on the individuality of each distillery, which again comes back to that place. But you know, is it useful? It remains a useful way to say there are different styles of whiskey being made all across Scotland. But I don't think we can hang our hat, as we used to do, on there being a lowland style and the highland style and the Speyside style, etc., etc.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I think when you look at it now, you know, that there's more and more Speyside distilleries that are making peated whiskies, for argument's sake, and obviously Islay distilleries that are coming away from the peated, and you know, they're the sort of things that we look at when we talk about Speyside. It's like that fruity flavour, and then we're suddenly getting peated whiskies.
Yeah, but you know,
going back to originality,
the individual distillery is what's important. You know, I don't know. I'd like to hear Sam's take on it.
I was just about to say, I wonder what Sam thinks to that.
Sam doesn't think about anything. Sam doesn't care, and he hopes you don't. No, the only bit I would zoom out slightly, especially because we're a group of fucking geeks, is to remember that this is an intimidating category that remains very difficult. In fact, probably more difficult than ever to navigate. Not just because we're not dealing just with Scotland, we're dealing with the whole world. And whether we see it as a lock coming, Dave, as you're saying, which I love that metaphor, that we're wading or paddling in this lock that's coming. There seems to be plenty of appetite for the whiskeys of the world, but it's a hard thing to navigate. And if we just look at Scotch, which is still seen at the height of the top of this hierarchy of the whiskeys of the world. There are distillery names that you risk being embarrassed and shamed by your friends and colleagues every time you say them. To be able to know and navigate this confusing category by region, whether it's true after intellectual scrutiny or not, doesn't really matter at the beginning. We want to welcome more people to enjoy whiskey in their glass. That's why I don't see it maybe as cynically as maybe that metaphor suggests, Dave. That there's plenty of room in the glasses of the middle classes probably to drink whiskey, premium craft whiskeys around the world. They might not be Glencairns, they might be mugs or enamel or ceramic. They might be highball glasses. But people who want to sit around and have a lanyard holding this glass, we already know those people. But there's a whole world of whiskey outside there that people are still trying to be attracted. We want to be able to welcome to whiskey. And I still think that the regions are a way to do it. That being said, the way we speak about regions, even as an industry, is always, first of all, legally incorrect most of the time. Even big companies talk about it in the wrong regulated areas. So there's a lot of misinformation, but I still think any tool that gets you in a way that you can comprehend, whether that's geographically or flavor-wise or whatever it is for you, is welcome.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think, Nick?
I'm always a bit puzzled about where and when the terminology of regions started being used, and certainly
it's you guys. What are you talking about?
I'm thinking classic malts, to be perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
So I was quite surprised to see that really the use of regional terminology in the whiskey trade, which starts really in the 1860s and 1870s, is all as a guide for speculators and investors who are buying new make whiskey from distilleries. So every significant trade journal had a page which would say, well, Islays are up this week, Highlands are down, Lowlands, and that's for Campbelltown, always going down, you know. So this idea of whiskies representing something was about price. It was all about price and value, because there is somewhere some correlation between price and value. And of course, the value of the whiskies was determined by the demand from blenders. So, for example, Islay whiskey went through a really bad time in the 1880s and early 1890s as people started that shift away from toddy whiskies to lighter blends. And every week is about Islays going down, production's cut, distillers can't sell their whiskey to bonders. So it's not the blenders that are buying for the most part. It's bonders, speculators who buy these whiskies and then sell them on when they're sort of reasonably mature to people that want them. So that history of regionality sort of starts with a sort of finance thing, and then it comes into blending. And if you look at the earliest blending records and people talking about how blends were put together, it was pretty simple. You blended by region. Now, within each region, we know, and it's always been the case, there's a huge diversity of style and character. But basically, you know, you'd have what you call your North Country malts, you'd have your Lowlands, you'd have your Campbelltowns, and on paper, and we've got Alexander Walker, second Sir Alexander Walker's notebooks, and this is exactly how he did it. It would sort of be 6-part North Country, 2-part Highland, 1-part grain, you know, whatever. So it was a useful shorthand from a business perspective and from a blending perspective. And I think when blenders were using the language like that, they obviously had an idea that you could take, for example, if you took 10 different Highlands, you'd end up with that Highland character that you wanted. I mean, they might all be quite different, but you mix 10 of them together and you're sort of going to get what you need, you know. So it's a very loose thing. But when you've got 100